God has done in your life. Song reminds us to give Him the glory for all those things. So we're going to try and do that. If you've got your Bibles with you, turn with me to the book of Judges. Book of Judges. So we finished up Galatians a couple weeks back and began praying about where we were going to go and felt led to an Old Testament book. I know we're walking through the New Testament as we're doing our scriptures and stuff each and every week as a church. And so I was like, well, let's mix in some Old Testament. And so I was praying through stuff, and God had led me to Judges. And as I began studying, I kind of figured out why. Because there's just a lot of similarities in the nation of Israel and where we are today, even believers and stuff, and the things that we deal with. And so as we walk into this, it'll show us some reminders of the things that we're not supposed to do. If you're wanting to take notes and stuff with this, I've kind of entitled where we're going and what you find in chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. Partial obedience is not obedience. Partial obedience is not obedience. And so before we get into the actual text part of it, and we're going to walk through, it's going to be, for some of what we're reading today is going to be rehashing when we walk through the book of Joshua. Some of the different things, not the whole book, but some of those things you're going to say, hey, those sound familiar because they happen in the book of Joshua, and you get kind of a recap in the book of Judges here. But as I was reading through and trying to search the commentaries for some of the background of Judges, there's not a whole lot that we do know about the book of Judges. We don't know the author. It is not specifically spelled out. There are some that believe that it was written by Samuel, but that is not known for certain. And so they typically tell you that the author is unknown. We don't know exactly the time period that the book was written, but we do know the time period it was written about. The time period it's written about was from the conquest of the Promised Land, because we're going to look at that in Judges chapter 1, all the way to the monarchy, to where the nation of Israel had asked for a king, and God gives them that. And so this is that time in between. Most people would tell you that's 14th century BC, early 14th century BC, because they believe Joshua passed away the late 1300s BC, all the way to the latter part of the 11th century BC. So we're looking at a span of about 350 years here, depending on the timelines and stuff that you look at. But most of them believe that part of it. So we don't know directly who wrote it. We don't know exactly when it was written, although it is believed to have been written after the monarchy was established, because most of us looks back to this. You'll see this phrase, especially in the middle part towards the end of the book. This time frame that they wrote about was characterized by this phrase that we see in Judges. It says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And so that kind of tells us that when it was written during the time that there was a king in Israel, but it was looking back to this time saying, hey, there wasn't that specific leader, although there were judges who were raised to lead the people here. And so that's kind of our timeline there. Again, there's not a whole lot that we know as far as the specifics of those, but they've got a ballpark with some of the stuff that happened. Some of the people would tell you that it's most likely written late 600 BC, early 700 BC is kind of that time frame that it may have been written in, but it was all written about between the Promised Land, the conquest of the Promised Land, and the establishment of the monarchy in the nation of Israel, which you find that in 1 Samuel. You kind of see Samuel write about that transition to that time frame there. So not a whole lot that we know about the time frame and the author, but the message and the purpose of this book is pretty clear. The message and the purpose of the book of Judges is pretty clear, because Judges was written for the purpose of basically recording the spiritual decline of the nation of Israel. As you walk through the book of Judges, you watch them go from a place where they see God conquer a land and give them land that they could not have taken on their own. And we'll even see that in some of the conquest here in chapter 1, to a place where they're losing their land at the end. Some of the tribes lose their land because they didn't do exactly what God told them to do. Chapter 1 kind of hits into that, but the message, the purpose of this book, it walks through really the spiritual and the moral decline of the nation of Israel. And as I was reading about that, and I knew that about the book of Judges, but being reminded, it was one of those things that kind of pulls you into where we are today, unfortunately. And I'm not talking about a specific nation in general. It's just people in general. The morals are declining. Those that hold to their religion, there's a spiritual decline across the globe, and we see issues that are happening today that many of you couldn't have imagined when you were a teenager or when you were a young adult or whatever the case may be. You're looking and going, we're so far removed from the generation you were born into to where we are today. And I can even say that myself. In the 37 and a half years that I've lived, it has changed drastically from the late 80s to 2024. There's been a lot that has changed throughout that time, and I wanted us to walk through this, because not only does it show what people will do naturally if you allow them to, but it also highlights the goodness of God. It shows His grace and His long-suffering, His patience with people, even when we're not who we're supposed to be. Even when we're not following the things that we're supposed to be, God is still good. And so there's hope for us today that no matter what the world is doing around us, we can still lean into the goodness of God and lean into His grace and His mercy, knowing that no matter what it looks like outside those walls, no matter what it looks like in the world around us, as our world seems to be falling apart, God is still the same. And so we get to hold on to that truth. And so there's some encouragement that you can find in this. It's not typically seen as an encouraging book, but you do see that pattern of God's grace walking through the book of Judges there. And so one of the things that to note, because the judges, that's what they were called. They were the leaders of that time. But they're not what we think of as judges. They're not ones who sit there with a gavel in hand and their robe and they're casting legal decisions. But they were not necessarily legal arbitrators as we think of, but they were more spirit-filled individuals that were chosen by God to lead His people. So they were the spiritual leaders of the people. Some of them were warriors. Some of them led the people into battle. They freed them from the oppression of the people around them. Some of them didn't even fight a battle, but they were still the spiritual leaders of that time. And so don't want us to get confused thinking judges, thinking, hey, we've got somebody sitting in a courtroom, that's what their job was. No, they were just the leaders, and they were called judges because they did pass that judgment on to people that came from God. But it's not in the same sense that we normally think of today. I ran across a description of the book of Judges that I wanted to share with y'all. And the guy's name, in one of the commentaries I read, he wrote about the book there. His Duguid is his last name, D-U-G-U-I-D. I don't know if it is necessarily Duguid or not, but that is how you spell his last name. He describes the book of Judges like this. The book of Judges demonstrates what happens to the Lord's people when everyone does whatever they want. It shows that Israel cannot take for granted God's grace, and neither can we. If we abandon his commandments and pursue the idols of our own imagination, the result will be moral and spiritual chaos. This is where we would all end up if the Lord left us to ourselves. The book of Judges also offers a profound commentary on the grace of God. Left to their own devices, the Israelites would surely have destroyed themselves. Only by the repeated gracious intervention of God did they emerge from this period as a people and nation distinguishable in lifestyle and beliefs from the surrounding pagan groups. He kind of gives that summation there of what you're going to see. You're going to see a people, the nation of Israel, that almost seems to take God's grace for granted. They look and they just expect him to show up whenever they get into trouble without them doing the things that they're supposed to do on their end. And so what you see in this timeline, the interesting thing is that early on, as you get into the Judges, which will start in chapter 3 with Othniel, we'll get to him in part of his story in just Othniel, Caleb's nephew. He's the first judge that shows up in Judges chapter 3. But as you start in the book of Judges, you see that they seem to turn a little bit quicker than as you go throughout. The time span gets wider and wider and wider, that it takes them longer to turn back to God, to cry out for deliverance. And you also see that sometimes those terms for the judges, they're not as long. So God may deliver his people, but that freedom doesn't last as long, and the gaps in between it seem to take a little bit longer. And so it's intriguing how you watch that decline of the people as you go throughout that. I think there's, like I said earlier, there's a lot of similarities to where we are today and what we see. And so it's an intriguing book to read through and kind of remind us about where we are as a people and the cautions not to get sucked into that same type of lifestyle that they did. Some people will tell you when you read the book of Judges that it is almost a cry for a king. Like it's one of those of, hey, this is why we need a king, because we can't do this on our own. We keep messing up. We keep faltering. We keep having these failures. But in reality, it is almost quite the opposite. It is a understanding that they should have just trusted God as their king. And God is showing them multiple times over and over and over again that he is enough for them, but they still want that physical presence of somebody to lead them. And for me, the reminder in all of that is we have to be careful not to follow a specific person. As believers, we've got to be careful not to look and go, I'm putting all my trust in that person. Because I've never met a person who didn't make mistakes. Neither have you. There's no perfect person. And when we put our faith in man instead of God, we're going to be let down. At some point in time, I'm just going to be real with you. At some point in time, I will let you down. It's just reality of life. That's the way it goes. I don't desire to do that. That will never be my intention. I hope you will give me grace if I ever do. But there's a really good chance, because I'm human, that if we are in relationship long enough, I will let you down at some point in time. Just the nature of it. In the nation of Israel, what they desired was they desired to have somebody sit on a throne to lead them into battle, to tell them what to do, and to show them where it is they were supposed to go. That is a position that God had taken over, had done for that nation since he established it with Abraham. He gave Abraham Isaac to continue that nation. He promised it to Abraham, and that fulfillment came all the way through Jacob and through Joseph delivering them and providing for them. It went all the way down that line. God had continued to provide for the people. He sent them people to lead them, but they tended to put their faith in the man that was leading them more so than God. You see that in the life of Moses as he leads them through the wilderness. They get captivated by that, and they look and go, well, who's going to lead us now that Moses is gone? Well, God had already established Joshua. We walked through the story of Joshua, and Joshua was a great leader for the people, but he was still not God. And you see their trajectory is to look to an individual to show them what they were supposed to do. When God kept giving them reminder after reminder that you're supposed to follow me. Now, He may put people in our path that will help lead us in that direction. That's perfectly fine. But along the way, we've got to make sure that we're following God no matter what. And that we don't let man get in our way of following God. You don't let me get in your way of you following God's will for your life. I can't tell you what God's will for your life is. I can pray for you. I can point you in. I can give you counsel. I can do different things, but I can't tell you what God's will for your life is. My job is to equip the saints to do the work of ministry. Y'all are the saints that God has given me to equip to do the work of ministry. That's my job. You're still supposed to follow God ever how He leads, ever how He shows you. The work that you do is you are following Him. We're on that journey together. We're going there together as a church body, as a church family. But at the end of the day, you've got to make sure that you're following God. The nation of Israel wanted somebody in front of them so that they could look and say, I'm going to do what He says. And I don't have to worry about what God says. Because that guy is going to tell us what God says, and we're going to do that. And so there's a slow progression of them taking their eyes off of God and putting it on man, because that's what every nation around them had. Every nation around them had a king, and that's what they wanted for themselves. Although that's not what God had designed for them. So this book is not an appeal for a king for the nation of Israel. It's more of a calling for the nation to return to God and let Him be their king. And they survive only by the grace of God. You're going to read through this and you're going to look and go, I can't believe God gave them that many chances. Generation after generation after generation. 350 years of stubbornness, of disobedience, hard-headedness, and yet God continues to show them grace. And I'm grateful for that, because there are times that my life looks a lot like the nation of Israel, and I'm stubborn, I'm hard-headed, and God shows me grace, and I'm grateful for that. But the book of Judges shows us that they not only did they survive this time period by the grace of God, it also shows us the condition of the human heart. When we forget God and what He's done for us, we start to pursue other gods. And that's exactly what they do. They forget where God has brought them, what He has done for them, how He has delivered them time and time and time again. And they chase after other gods. They chase after things they can hold, things they can see. And the reality of it is we do that too. We try to fill God's void in our life with other things. We have family members that we look and go, hey, I know what you need. I understand what it is that you need. You need a relationship with the Lord. That's going to be the only thing that satisfies this itch that you have. But they're going to put other things in that place because those things are tangible. Those are things that they see. Those are things that they can grasp hold of that give them those temporary pleasures instead of the long-lasting pleasure that God can give. We understand that. But the world doesn't necessarily see that, because the message of the cross is foolishness. They don't understand this. They don't get why Jesus would do that for them, or why they need somebody to do that for them. And so they turn to other gods. And sadly, sometimes we do too. We look and go, hey, you know what? For us, sometimes to numb the pain, to satisfy the desires, we slip, we fail, we fall into temptation to go to something else. Thankfully, for the grace of God, He allows us to come back, ask for that forgiveness, and remind us that, hey, I'm all you need. And so that's what the book of Judges is. It's a reminder that God is all that the nation of Israel truly needs. It's broken into 3 different sections. There's the introduction that's just really the first 2 chapters and the first 5 or 6 verses in chapter 3. And then you've got the core of the book, which outlines 6 major judges and 6 minor judges. There are some that are highlighted a little bit more. There's some bigger details in there for the 6 major ones. And then there's some that just have a few verses or just 1 verse about them, but they still judged the people. They still led the people for a moment. And those start in chapter 3, verse 7, going all the way through chapter 16, which is one of the popular judges in Samson. And so we see his story in all of this and really his demise. Samson is one of my favorite characters growing up because as a boy, he was the strong guy in the Bible. But as I've gotten older, I've understood more of his story. And there's things that I can identify with in his story, but there's also things that I look at and go, man, he wasted a lot. There's actually a Bible study out there that I've led through with Samson. It's called A Life Well Wasted. And it's there's some really good stuff that you break down in that y'all may, it's an older study, so some of y'all may have even walked through that yourselves. But an intriguing story that we'll get to later on in the book. But he kind of caps the end of the Judges there, and then the last 4 or 5 chapters is really the appendix that kind of shows the continued decline, religious and moral decline of the people. And you get through the Judges, and then you see chapter 17 through 21 just keep rolling downhill. It just keeps getting worse and worse for the people. That's when they start to lose territory. They're starting to lose parts of the promised land and stuff that God had already given them because of their disobedience that we find here in chapter 1. So that's kind of the background of it. I like to kind of build you up to where we are. Again, this chapter 1, we're gonna kind of fly through some of this, just hit these in bigger sections, because for many of us, this is going to be a recap of what we walked through with the book of Joshua, and it kind of puts them two together here. So Judges chapter 1. Starting in verse 1, it says this: Now it came about after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, saying, Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? We'll pause there for a moment, because in chapter 2, you're going to find us talking about the death of Joshua again. And so this is part of that recap. It's going through what happened after this. It's establishing a leader for the nation of Israel in the first chapter, and then chapter 2, where we'll pick up next week, picks up where Joshua has died yet again, although he's already died. It goes all the way back to his death and walking through the establishment of that first judge there and what the people do after Joshua leaves. But this is all talking about the territories and stuff, the nation of Israel, because when Moses was nearing the end of time, it was already clear who was going to succeed him. He had already told the people, hey, Joshua is going to lead the people. He had already set that up for them. So when Moses was nearing the end of his leadership, before God put him to rest there on the mountain as he looked over the promised land, because he wasn't allowed to go, Joshua is already established as the leader. When Joshua dies, there wasn't a leader that was already established. So kudos in one way that the nation of Israel would look and go, hey, who are we supposed to follow now? But it also kind of sets up the mindset of the people that, hey, we don't have a leader, so what are we supposed to do? Without a leader, they weren't going to do anything. So God establishes a leader for them in Judah, but they asked the question, said, who's going to go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? Because they're still clearing the land. Remember when we left in Joshua, they still had some land to conquer that they were supposed to take over. There were still some nations that they were supposed to drive out. The Canaanites were one of those big ones. And so they asked, who's going to lead us into battle against them? Verse 2 gives us that answer. The Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. Then Judah said to Simeon his brother, come up with me into the territory allotted me, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I in turn will go with you into the territory allotted you. So Simeon went with him. Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they defeated 10,000 men at Bezek. Now, you see God fighting the battles just like he did in the book of Joshua. He's going before him. He's established this. They're following God. They go into their territories. They're fighting these battles. They're doing what God had asked them to do. And so it is successful. They found Adonai-Bezek in Bezek and fought against him, and they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and Adonai-Bezek fled, and they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Graphic. Book of Judges does that sometimes. There's some cool stories in Judges that I know students have enjoyed in the past because you get some war stories there. But what they did here is they treated him, because look at what verse 7 says. Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to gather up scraps under my table as I have done, so God has repaid me. So they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. The only problem with all of this, and we're going to see this in everything, God was very clear what he wanted the people to do when they went in the promised land. You say, Joshua, how do you know that? Well, Deuteronomy 7 verses 1 and 2 says this. When the Lord your God brings you into the land where you are entering to possess it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and stronger than you. Verse 2 says, and when the Lord your God delivers them before you and you defeat them, then you shall utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them and show no favor to them. Deuteronomy 7, God gave those instructions in those first 2 verses. This is what you're supposed to do with the people. You're not supposed to leave any of them there. He told them that under Moses' leadership. He said, when you get into the promised land, you're supposed to cut them all off. Don't make any covenants with them. Don't make any oaths with them. You get rid of them because that's what I'm telling you to do. A glimpse into some of the stuff that they did in Joshua, and we're going to rehash that when we get to verse 11 there. But here, even with this king, they treated him the same way that he had treated other ones. We don't know if the specific number was 70 of the people, the kings that crawled under his table, but we know that apparently he was very victorious in battle. So much so that he had lots of nations that he had conquered, because every nation had a king in that time, no matter how big or small it was. They had a leader. He had conquered a lot of those leaders, and he had treated them in this way. They did the exact same thing to him that he had done to other leaders, but God told them to do something different. Now, he would eventually die there, so he's not going to be an issue for them down the road. But it was partial obedience, not complete obedience. Let's continue on. Verse 8 says, then the sons of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. Afterward, the sons of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites living in the hill country and in the Negev and in the lowland. So Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron formerly was Kiriath Arba. And they struck Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai. And so they capture the city of Jerusalem. A side note in that, We don't believe that they actually inhabited the city yet. It is believed that the first time that they do that is under King David, when he takes over Jerusalem there. So it'd be some time before that ever happened. Most people would date that around the year 1000 BC. But nonetheless, they go through. God conquers these nations. He's still fighting their battles as they walk through the promised land that they were given. It walks us through even more of the history, starting in verse 11. It talks about some familiar stories there that we saw in Joshua chapter 15. It says, from there he went against the inhabitants of Debir. This is verse 11 of Judges 1. Now the name of Debir formerly was Kiriath Sepher. And Caleb said, the one who attacks Kiriath Sepher and captures it, I will even give him my daughter Achsah for a wife. Remember that story from Joshua 15? We walked through it. He said, hey, whoever takes this, you get my daughter's hand in marriage. Apparently that was a common practice in that time. You see that kings would say, hey, you go fight this battle. Your reward for winning this battle for my people is my daughter's hand in marriage. Caleb did the same thing. Othniel, in verse 13, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it, so he gave him his daughter Achsah for a wife. Then it came about when she came to him, she persuaded him to ask her father for a field. Then she alighted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, what do you want? She said to him, give me a blessing, since you have given me the land of the Negev. Give me also springs of water. So Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. And so you see the story of Caleb that's rehashed here that we already saw in Joshua 15, where he gives Othniel. And that's important because he becomes the first judge in Judges chapter 3, starting in verse 7. He is going to become the first judge. He is a successor of Caleb's lineage through his brother there. He was the son of Kenaz, which is Caleb's younger brother. And so there's some parallels in that. But we rehash that same story. Caleb didn't do that twice. It's the same story for Joshua 15 that is rehashed here in Judges. And so it continues walking through the cities that were captured. It says the descendants in verse 16, the descendants of the Kenite, Moses, his father-in-law, went up from the city of palms with the sons of Judah to the wilderness of Judah, which is in the south of Arid, and they went and lived with the people. Then Judah went with Simeon, his brother, and they struck the Canaanites living in Zephath and utterly destroyed it. So the name of the city was called Hormah. And Judah took Gaza with its territory, and Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. Now the Lord was with Judah. That's important to note. And they took possession of the hill country, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. They didn't drive out everybody in the valley. And this is the reason we walk back through this, is because this is setting the stage for where they are going. They weren't able to drive them all. So verse 20 says, then they gave Hebron to Caleb as he had asked, as Moses had promised. And he drove out from there the three sons of Anak. But the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Likewise, the house of Joseph went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. The house of Joseph spied out Bethel, a very similar Jericho story here. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz. The spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, please show us the entrance to the city, and we will treat you kindly. Reminds you kind of how they dealt with Rahab. So he showed them the entrance to the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword. But they let the man and all his family go free. The man went into the land of the Hittites and built a city and named it Luz, which is its name to this day. Walked through a lot of stuff that we've walked through along the way already in the past, and just kind of that reminder of what they were doing. And while there are similarities, the difference in Rahab and the people that Joshua was leading into the promised land is Rahab became a part of the nation of Israel. She believed in the God that was fighting those battles for him. This man here, the difference is he helped the nation of Israel get into the city, led them to the entrance. They destroyed the city. He went and lived somewhere else. He never became a part of the people. And so they should not have let him live because that was part of what God had told them to do. They showed favor to someone who God had not led in their, had not asked them to. Rahab was a different story. So you may say, hey, why did Rahab get to live and these people should not have? Because Rahab became a part of the nation of Israel. She was almost adopted into it because she believed in the God that was delivering them. This man just said, hey, there's the city gates. I'll show you how to get in. And then him and his family got to go away free, and they started their own city, which would be an issue for the nation of Israel later on. So we walked through all of that to show some of the things they were supposed to do. Caleb did the things right. He went in, he destroyed all the people. He didn't leave anybody in the cities that he conquered. But you see in verse 21, the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites. Joseph, the house of Joseph, likewise, just like Benjamin's the sons of Benjamin, they didn't drive out everybody. They didn't destroy everyone. And so you start to see the people not doing everything that God had asked them to do. You're seeing partial obedience. You're seeing God deliver them despite them not doing everything they're supposed to. The next part of this continues to walk through some of those cities that we saw in the book of Joshua that were not conquered yet again. Verse 27 says, But Manasseh did not take possession of Bethshean and its villages, or Taanach and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Eblam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. So the Canaanites persisted in living in that land. It came about when Israel became strong that they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. A reminder that the people did not do what it is that God asked them to do, even when they were strong enough to do it. Even when God showed them favor, He told them, you are supposed to drive the people out. And they held them as slaves. They desired to have the people work for them instead of destroying them. The work would have been done. They weren't hurting for labor, but it was giving them a status saying, hey, we've got this forced labor. We've got slaves, is essentially what it was. It's called forced labor, but it was slavery in that day. They forced the people to work for them. But the thing is, what God knew about them was that if you don't force them out, then their beliefs are going to creep in on your beliefs. And that was the problem. They didn't force them out, so they still had a voice in their homes. They still saw different things. They still brought in their gods, their pagan gods. They didn't make them get rid of those. So those things would have been in the homes that they were in. They would have worshiped those gods despite being in homes of people who were from the nation of Israel. They were supposed to destroy them because they were going to bring in things that were going to draw them away from the Lord. Not because He didn't want them to have things, because they were going to open their eyes to other things. You can go all the way back to the Garden of Eden, where Eve and Adam were told one tree. There's only one that they couldn't use for food. They had all the other trees. They had all the other vegetation that was good for food in the garden. There was only one that they were not supposed to touch. Which one did they desire the most once the voice started through the serpent? The one they couldn't have. For us, it's the same thing in our life. If we allow the thing that we're not supposed to have to stay around, it will be the thing that has the strongest pull in our lives. It's going to be the thing that captures our attention. It's going to be the thing that captures our eyes. We have to completely remove it because we're not strong enough to do anything on our own about it. We have to take it out, or to be the thing that captures our attention. God said, don't inhabit these people. Go, take the land that I'm giving you. Enjoy the land because the land is yours. But don't leave the people who are occupying the land. Because if you do, they're going to draw you away from me. So you continue to see that. And even when they're strong, they put them in as forced labor there in verse 28. 29 gives us the same thing. Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who were living in Gezer, so the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalo. So the Canaanites lived among them and became subject to forced labor. 31, Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Acco or the inhabitants of Sidon or of Alab or of Akzib or of Helbah or of Aphek or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Again, verse 33, Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, but lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, and the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath became forced labor for them. Then the Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country. See, all the other ones, they became forced labor, except for the tribe of Dan. The Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the valley. The tribe of Dan didn't even get the land that was promised to them because the people weren't going to let them have it. The people who were already there, because they weren't doing what God had told them to do. Yet the Amorites persisted in living in Mount Heres, in Ajalon, and in Shelbim. But when the power of the house of Joseph grew strong, they became forced labor. The border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward. Each tribe, over and over. It's the same old story. And you're going to feel like that walking through the book of Judges. Like, haven't we read this already? It's the same old story because they weren't doing what it is that they were supposed to do. They weren't doing what God had told them to do back in Deuteronomy 7 when he said, when you get to the land, this is what I want you to do. They forgot what they were supposed to do. Or they saw that the work was hard and they decided that they weren't going to do that. Or they saw that the people would be really good slaves for them. So they said, hey, I've got an even better idea, God, than what you told us to do. We'll just bring them in and make them work for us. And then we don't have to do it. They can harvest the crops for us. They can do the things around the house. They can build things for us that we won't have to do. We can make them our laborers. God said, that's not what I asked you to do. I promised to do this for you if you would drive out the people. And we're going to step into chapter 2, just the first 5 verses, because it shows us God's response to everything that we just rehashed in chapter 1. It says this, Now the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochum, and he said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. God said, I am a God of my word. I gave you the place that I told people that you've never seen with your own eyes that you were going to get because you are their descendants. I promised Abraham, before I ever gave him a son, that he was going to be the father of the nation and he was going to live in the promised land. He promised Moses when he told him to go back to Egypt, a place that he had already left. He promised that he would lead the people to the promised land. The people that we're talking about here, there's some of them that wouldn't even remember Moses. Because you got to remember all the adult males, the ones that were of fighting age, died in the wilderness because they weren't obedient. So the only guys that were around were really, really young under Moses' leadership. So there's a really good chance that after following Joshua for the time that he led the nation of Israel, that the men there would not remember Moses. And if they did, they only remember him from a young age. So walking through the timelines here of all of this, they don't even remember Moses. They sure don't remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because they never saw them, because they were in Egypt as slaves for 400 years. But God said, I promise those guys this land that you're getting to enjoy, because I made a covenant with them. He said, I'll never break my covenant with you. Verse 2 says, and as for you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed me. What is this you have done? He said, you didn't listen. I told you the things to do. I told you what you were supposed to do when you got to the land. The instructions have been clear. You've been reminded. Moses told you the first time. Joshua reminded you of that. The tribes knew what they were supposed to do when they got into the land, but they decided once God fought these battles for them and gave them this land, they decided to do their own thing, and God had had enough. Verse 3 says, therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they will become as thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. He said, these people are going to be an issue for you. Because you didn't do what I asked you to do, they're going to be an issue. Because he said, I already told you what to do. I gave you the land. I gave you the ability to drive them out. You decided not to, said, so I'm not going to do it anymore. You didn't keep your end of the bargain. Why should I do that on my end? So he said, there'll be thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the sons of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bachem, which means weepers, and there they sacrificed to the Lord. If you continue reading, which we'll continue, not tonight, we'll continue as we walk through, what we see right here looks like a sign of repentance. The people cry out, they're weeping. There's a public display of what we believe should be repentance. They even named this place Weepers, Bachem, which means weepers. They named it that because they were so heartbroken over what God had just told them in this place. When God came and met with them and said, I'm not going to do this anymore, it appeared to break their hearts. But as you read on, their actions moving forward showed very few signs of authentic repentance. As we walk through this, you're going to look and go, hey, I saw what you did at that altar, but it doesn't really look real now, because it doesn't take us long. We'll get to it in chapter 2. It doesn't take us long for the people to move away from that broken heart back into the people that they were. For us, the reminder of this is true repentance happens when we turn away from the things that break God's heart. When we turn away from the things that God has challenged us with, and we want to be a people of true repentance, we want to see God truly change us, that's when we look and go, hey God, I see that this does break your heart. Lord, I am asking for your forgiveness, and I am telling you I'm not going back to that place. But oftentimes that takes us hitting rock bottom to say, I can never go back there because I don't want to experience that again. On the outside, it looked like that. Today, we see people fill the altars of a church that are weeping and they're broken, but then come Monday morning, we're right back where it is. I'll be honest with you. And it's going to sound bad, but I'm going to be honest with you. I would rather true repentance happen in the pews than fake brokenness happen here in the altar. Every time. I would rather nobody ever step forward and come pray beside the place that I stand, and life change happen while they're standing there singing that song, than somebody come and pray and make a spectacle of what it is that they think that we need to see. I don't need that, because what you do in the altar is not about me. It's not about a message that I'm speaking. It's about you and God. I don't ever want us to get to the place where we're just filling altars, where we're crying out, and we may have wet stains on this carpet here that we can't get rid of that'll make us look religious. That's not what I desire to see. I desire to see a people who are changed because of their encounter with God. The nation of Israel was not that. They wept out loud, but they weren't truly changed. So our caution is, we don't do things in a public way unless it has true private meaning to us. It is okay to come and weep in the altar. It is okay to bring people here to say, hey, I need my village to surround me. And you know what? God is asking me to bring this to the front so that people will pray with me. I've been trying to give it up on my own, and I'm supposed to come up here and do it. That's great. Please come and do that if that's what God is asking you to do. But don't make this a public showing so people will look and go, oh, poor them. That's not what this is for. This is a place for you to deal with what God is asking you to deal with. And if your private closet is more meaningful than the public altar, then I would ask you to choose your private closet every time. Because the things that they were supposed to be dealing with is their heart issues that they have. And the reality of it is, the reason people are broken is because we all have heart issues. Thing is, I can't fix a heart issue, and neither can you. The only one who can fix a heart issue is God. And so we have to take it to Him, and we've got to truly deal with that with Him. The nation of Israel gets further and further away from dealing with that heart issue throughout the book of Judges. And so we're going to watch moral decline. We're going to watch spiritual decline as we walk through this book. We're seeing that out in our world. The caution for us is that we never look and go, hey, if I'll make it a public spectacle, then it will appear that I've got everything all right. I don't want appearances. I want it to truly be changed. I want you to truly deal with the things that are going on in your life. I want you to truly be broken over those things. I want a broken people. I don't want people who are trying to make a show of what they think God is trying to do here. My prayer is that we'd be broken. And some of y'all may say, Josh, stop asking for me to be broken, because right now I'm at the place where I can only take so much. I'm asking for all of us to be broken. And generally, I start that conversation with start breaking me first. If I ever pray for change, I'm asking God to change me first. The nation of Israel here would show a brokenness as a public spectacle. But as you read on, you see that there wasn't a whole lot of remorse in the things they do. And unfortunately, sometimes we fall in that same category, that we're going to look and go, hey, publicly I can do the things that I'm supposed to do, but privately I'm not doing those things. So our challenge to us is to make sure that we're not doing partial obedience, that we're not falling into the same category that the nation of Israel was, because guess what? Partial obedience is simply disobedience. It's either 100% obeying or it's not. God is looking for us to obey Him completely. So I don't know how God is asking you to do that, but we're going to be walking through examples of how not to do that over the next several weeks as we walk through the book of Judges. And hopefully it'll be an encouragement that we'll continue to see God's grace so that when we do mess up, when we don't obey like we're supposed to, we see that God continues to be faithful. And so we'll quickly turn and try to follow him in 100% obedience. Let's turn to our prayer and praise list tonight. I want to thank y'all